For thousands of years, human progress did not happen because we simply accumulated observations. It happened because we learned which observations deserved to survive as premises for the next generation of inferences. The Babylonians knew the morning star, they knew the evening star. What they lacked was not observation, but the conceptual resources to infer that both were Venus. Centuries later, Galileo faced a similar problem. Motion itself had to be reconceptualized before mathematics could organize it into a new inferential framework. The observations were often already there. The conceptual organization wasn't. This is the real story of scientific progress. Not new facts arriving, but new inferences becoming possible. Concepts don't just accumulate, they get reorganized. Some patterns get promoted into settled truths, others get discarded based on what can now be inferred from what. Why do some regularities disappear into history, while others become analytical foundations from which entire new sciences grow? Frege believed this transformation was not a leap outside thought, not a psychological miracle, and not an appeal to mysterious intuition. He did not imagine the history of thought settlements as Hegel did, but he did try to build a symbolism in which every conceptual enrichment could be absorbed into the same analytical framework. Instead of multiplying disconnected necessities or appealing to psychological intuition, he believed it happened inside inference itself. Concepts become richer by preserving successful judgments, reorganizing them into identities and differences that future reasoning can inherit without reopening the entire debate. That, I think, is Frege's most pragmatic inheritance. He sought to explain how successful inferences become settled conceptual resources, how empirical discoveries can eventually be inherited as transparent analytical starting points for new reasoning. This series is about that transformation, how observation becomes meaning, how meaning becomes inference, and how inference becomes the architecture of knowledge itself.
The 19th century ended under what many regarded as a crisis in the foundations of mathematics. The emergence of non-Euclidean geometries, competing accounts of arithmetic, and rival foundational programs seemed to undermine precisely what mathematics had always claimed as its distinctive mark: necessity. If different methods could lead to the same conclusions, what made any one of them the correct method? At the center of this problem, in a sense, brings us back to Kant. What are the basic categories we choose when we reason, and why do some of them acquire priority in the constitution of knowledge? The idea that time, for instance, might unify certain forms of inference, as in mathematics, suggests that the structure of experience is not neutral, but actively organizes the very patterns of necessity. The problem for Frege was that Kant's solution sacrificed clarity and assumed a prior native framework charged with intuitive content. One may learn that 5 plus 2 is 7 this way, but cannot justify if the proposition was built from transparent steps or from the assistance of collected information of experience. It is in this context that Frege's progressive emerges, aiming to eliminate so-called transitions whose correctness depends on intuition, diagrams, or informal constructions that may lead to the right conclusion without it making clear why it follows necessarily from the premises. Interesting.
He wanted arithmetic to be thinkable within logic alone, formalizable without appeal to anything beyond concepts and thought, no extra logical step required. See how the two connect? Frege wanted the inferences we make in arithmetic to follow analytically from an axiomatic system, nothing imported from outside it, the same way father should already give you not son without a trip to the world. Numbers, on this view, aren't things with intrinsic identities you discover one by one. They constrain each other through reciprocal relations, the way father and son do. But if those relations are going to do real logical work, rather than being a projection we read into the numbers, or a mere implicature we happen to draw, they have to be represented, not gestured at, not assumed, built into the grammar as the form of the relation itself.
Why did Frege insist that logic could not simply be reduced to algebra? In the late 19th century, George Boole had shown that many logical inferences could be represented mathematically by relations between classes. It was a remarkable achievement, but Frege argued that something essential was missing. Suppose you introduce a new formal distinction, a new way of classifying things. The question isn't whether the distinction is mathematically consistent. The question is what thinking it does. How does it reorganize your system of beliefs? Which propositions become true because of it? Which become false? What new inferences does it license? Which old ones does it rule out? What cognitive ability does it actually extend?
When we talk about a hyperreferential or intentional solution, what we mean is this. Frege wanted to make inference a block of fortress that protects its conclusion in a deeper level. The move where a conclusion could be traced back and made compatible with more than one starting point. Call this the problem of reversibility. If a chain of reasoning can be run backward and land just as comfortably in a different framework, then the chain was never doing the work we credited it with. It looks like necessity, but it only ever delivered coincidence. So Frege's move was architectural, not just logical. Each layer of a proof had to be built so that it could only be supported by the layer beneath it in one determinate way, never by an equally good alternative route smuggled in afterward. Content, on this view, isn't just what a proposition happens to correspond to. It's the specific, non-substitutable path by which that correspondence was secured. This is what separates a genuine inference from mere pattern matching after the fact. Take what happens when we simply pile up observed black ravens, as if their accumulation were already ruling out a blue one. If confirmation or intuition transfers across logical equivalents, as Frege warned us against, anything at all that happens to be neither a raven nor black will converge on confirming the same claim, even things doing radically different logical and semantic work. A white shoe. It has nothing to do with ravens, nothing to do with the color black as a property of birds, and yet, on this logic, it counts. We get the conclusion right by the standards of the form learned from black ravens, but the form does not protect the inference at a hyperreferential level. That is, at a level deeper than the mere convergence of reference. A real inference doesn't just deliver P, it settles the result in a direction, and settles it irreversibly. Not in the sense that it can never be revised, but in the sense that once it happens, you can always trace it back to a single route of revision that cannot update incompatible network of beliefs.
Without a conceptual anchor, you can affirm that only healthy people are beautiful or reject that claim, without the formal partition itself determining what follows from either judgment. It preserves a formal opposition, but not the conceptual substance of the negation. The partition simply floats. It has no conceptual anchor.
So the choice comes down to this. Not which logic is more elegant, but which one actually pays for what it claims. One in which changing a judgment requires nothing more than drawing a different classificatory line?
Or one in which changing a judgment forces you to reconstruct an entire conceptual system. To understand Frege's conception of logic, we first have to recover the problem he thought logic was solving. It wasn't merely validity. It wasn't merely formal rigor. It was something much stranger, the transparency of thought. But what could it possibly mean for something to be transparent or for thinking to be transparent? I want to answer that by showing you two ways it can fail. The first, logic fails to be transparent if it doesn't update any knowledge at all. You get a result, but nothing around it moves. The second is subtler, and I think more important. Logic fails to be transparent even when it does update something. But the update stays ambiguous, unsettled, unable to fix which future revisions it now licenses and which it now forecloses. You get movement, but movement that does not point anywhere in particular. Someone thinking whatever else it does something to the rest of your system. It settles doubts, it closes some questions and opens others. An answer that leaves your entire network of commitments untouched isn't a thought, it is an oracle, and an oracle, however reliable, is not a reasoner. This,
as I put it in my own work on this, published in Cognitio in 2024, given a set of antecedent hypotheses, the extension of the truth functional implication, P implies Q, accurately represents what would be the safest hypothetical conditions under which Q can be stated. That's not nothing. It's already picking out a rational partition, not just a set theoretic one. Frege thought if P then Q was not merely a partition of true and false cases, it mapped the conceptual geography of reasoning, the region where accepting P reshapes the space of rational possibilities, such that asserting Q is no longer an independent decision at all. The conditional identifies a partition of logical space that is sensitive to some future revisions but not others. Changes that leave P intact preserve the commitment to Q, while revisions that withdraw P reopen the question entirely. So Frege approached the problem of inference by trying to make every step robust, building each transition so that it could not leap, could not smuggle in rebel material that might, unnoticed, go on to serve an enemy conclusion. But did he actually have an adequate answer as to how? Frege undoubtedly showed that many propositions Kant regarded as synthetic can be reconstructed through explicit inference. But that alone does not settle the philosophical question. A deduction can still carry synthetic commitments. The question is, which ones? Different synthetic enrichments could support the very same necessary inference, while interpreting its conceptual content differently. Perhaps this is the most interesting way to read Frege. Not as proving that arithmetic is purely analytic, but as arguing that his reconstruction is the most prudent one, the one that introduces the fewest conceptual commitments while preserving every inference. Read this way, logicism becomes less a metaphysical thesis and more a pragmatic principle of reason. When different conceptual enrichments sustain the same necessity, prefer the one that commits you least. But now a question surfaces that Carnap never fully answered. If all we have to do is choose a language, if the depth of our necessities, the cost of our truths, the floors of our meaning, are all products of a linguistic framework we selected, then how do we make that selection without already smuggling in assumptions about how a language ought to behave?
What Quine opened does not close here. Actually, I have pursued a solution by Michael Dummett, and I will present it here. It's in my published article called Reconciling Logical Pluralism with Meaning Theoretical Stability. As we saw, once the choice of a language already amounts to the projection of a framework, once the necessities generated by a system are partly consequences of the inferential machinery built into it. Once that happened, logic itself appears to lose any neutral ground. The framework produces the very forms of necessity it later discovers. But there is a response to this problem, and it emerges from Michael Dummett.
On page 66 of The Logical Basis of Metaphysics, Dummett argues that model theoretical semantics alone cannot adjudicate disputes about what inferential structures or what classical or non-classical logic are actually doing the cognitive work inside reasoning itself. For Dummett, a proof is not merely a chain of valid steps, it is a distribution of inferential weight across a semantic structure. A conclusion overreaches when the meaning theory beneath the proof cannot bear the load it attempts to carry. Without inferential harmony, one loses the ability to explain why a conclusion follows from this meaning theory rather than from an incompatible one. I think the deeper lesson is not merely that substitution sometimes fails, it is that a perfectly formal system can preserve distinctions while remaining conceptually opaque. A formal partition may faithfully distinguish A from non-A, yet still fail to tell us what follows from belonging to A, what it excludes, what counts as evidence for it, or how a judgment involving A should respond to new reasons. The formal distinction is there, the judgment is not. Suppose we replace A with red. Immediately, the classification becomes embedded in a rich network of incompatibilities and inferential commitments. If something is red, it is not blue in the same respect. Certain explanations become available, others are ruled out. Replace A instead with an opaque classifier such as grue, or with a purely statistical partition whose conceptual role is unknown, and that inferential network largely disappears. The issue is therefore not that one partition is mathematically superior to another, it is that one is conceptually anchored while the other is not. A verdict is cheaply reversible when an alternative procedure can systematically justify the opposite verdict while leaving the evidential basis essentially intact. Nothing substantial has changed in the evidence, only the mapping from evidence to conclusion has been rearranged. When that happens, the formal computation has failed to anchor the judgment. What blocks cheap reversals is not a more sophisticated formalism, it is a conceptual anchor, a network of evidential relations, material incompatibilities, and inferential commitments that makes reversing a judgment increasingly costly. For Kant, the cost comes from the conditions that make objective judgment possible. The reversal would cost the flip of all our conditions of knowledge. For Frege, from conceptual content rather than mere symbol manipulation. For Carnap, reversing a verdict would cost changing the very linguistic framework in which it is justified. For Quine, it would cost reorganize an entire web of belief. That brings us to conceptual incommensurability, the situation in which the distinctions that justify an inference in one framework simply do not exist in another.
Well, up to this point, we have been looking at the problem from the outside. We have seen that no amount of preserved truth values, substitutions, or operational verdicts is enough to tell us what a concept is. The same proposition can inherit some judgments and fail to inherit others.
Scientific progress is often pictured as a chain, each settled inference resting on the last, like courses of brick. But that image hides something. It assumes every link was tested by the same standard. It wasn't. What counted as an error and what counted as merely unexplained differed from ledger to ledger. That difference, not the strength of the evidence, decided what got carried forward. The point of a better symbolism is therefore not to reduce reasoning to formal calculation, but to recover the conceptual ledger that formal success has compressed into notation. We have already seen how merely operational verdicts can be reversed within fragile conceptual frameworks, or even in the absence of any articulated conceptual framework at all. Because those reversals leave no stable network of commitments behind, they cannot sustain a genuine ledger of conceptual costs. The pragmatist lesson is straightforward. Real inference does not operate over a score or an empty partition. It runs from settled statements to conclusions that inherit the weight of those prior commitments. If the evidence supporting one settlement could just as easily support the opposing conclusion, the inference is cheap to reverse. Just as a judicial verdict that can be overturned merely by appealing to broader constitutional rules without changing the facts is not a trustworthy verdict. A judgment earns its authority not by reaching a conclusion, but by making its reversal genuinely costly.